What if I told you that Seiko had quietly released a reasonably priced True GMT? One with a cool pattern dial, a diver's 200-meter rating, sapphire crystal, and you could find it for around $500 to $600. At that point, I'm betting a lot of you would be interested. However, like all things Seiko these days, the full story is a bit more complicated. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and today we're going to talk about the SFK001, otherwise known as the Sumo Solar GMT. And before we really get into it, I have one quick disclaimer, and that's that this watch was bought secondhand. It is in pretty good condition, but it isn't pristine. So just bear that in mind with the macros. That said, let's get to it. I'll throw up the specs here, and since this is a Seiko Sumo, size is important to talk about. But before we get to that, I want to talk about the movement. This one is using Seiko's 5K65 caliber, which if you somehow missed it, is a solar quartz movement with a true GMT complication. Now, if you're not familiar with GMTs, a GMT basically adds a fourth GMT hand to help keep track of a second time zone. There are really two different types. You have the more common colors GMT, and then you have this one, which is referred to as a true or traveler's GMT. And since true GMTs aren't as common, at least in this price range and especially with Seiko, that is one of the more interesting things about this one. On a collar's GMT, you can independently adjust the GMT hand, and on a traveler's, you can adjust the main hour. It's really a minor thing, but it does affect how you use it, as well as it makes one easier to use when you're traveling, and one if you just want to keep track of a second time zone. Hence the whole collars and travelers nicknames. It's also important to point out that this isn't Seiko's first true GMT, or even first quartz true GMT, as they have the more expensive and complicated 6R64 automatic movement, as well as for a while they had a kinetic-based true GMT, but this is their first solar version, which in a lot of ways I think is going to make it easier to use, as well as more accessible for the average person. Since it's solar, as long as it gets some sun, should be good to go. So even if you're a watch collector who prefers automatics, I think this one is interesting to know about, especially if Seiko winds up using this movement in other watches. Heck, I'd love to see some sort of true GMT Arnie. It's also a very interesting dial to see paired with a solar movement. Since they have to be somewhat translucent to let light through, typically most solar watches have duller or more boring dials. Whereas this one has this interesting bright metallic wavy sunburst pattern etched into it, which is then paired with raised indices and Seiko's typical Sumo handset, as well as this really bright orange GMT hand. Now the indices here aren't overly tall, meaning they're probably just pressed out of the back of the dial rather than applied. But everything comes through sharply, making it easy to read. Well, everything except perhaps the date window, which is just a simple cutout over at the right. That one seems a little small, as well as a little bit sunken, making it harder to make out. In between the indices, there are also odd hours for the GMT hand, as well as you have a raised chapped ring right on the outer edge, which is split right down the middle in two colors, one for day and one for night, which is typical with the GMT. Although typically that's something that's done on the bezel, like on this watch, rather than the chapter ring. And that is another really interesting twist with this one, as it has a normal diver's timing bezel. It's 120 click, unidirectional, all that typical stuff, rather than say a bidirectional GMT bezel. The action itself is typical Seiko, which is to say it's okay-ish, but the more important thing is to why they went this route. Over this last year, I remember seeing a couple of other reviews with watches that did something similar, making a dive-style GMT with a timing bezel. I think one was a micro brand and one was a San Martin. And on both of those, it seemed like most people came down on them pretty harshly just for not following tradition. And if I'm honest, I kind of did that as well. But after thinking about it and after living with it for a while, I think this might actually be the way to go. You see, if the dial has 24-hour indicators, like we do here, then at that point the GMT bezel is really just there to track a fourth time zone. Which, if we're being honest, very few people ever actually do. I know I haven't, and I know most watches just follow that for tradition's sake. Whereas with a timing bezel, I think more people would use it more often. So it's definitely a less traditional setup, but I think it's one that's more functional and useful. Overall though, it is a good looking, bright, engaging, and functional dial. Pretty much everything you'd want out of a diver or GMT. One of Seiko's biggest strengths has always been their design work, as they're able to come up with great, interesting, and highly usable designs. And that's exactly what they did here with this dial. Now, if this particular color isn't to your liking, I think there are two more colorways of the Sumo Solar GMT. You got a Pepsi, as well as this green Hulk or Mountain Dew version, in addition to this light blue Frost Gatorade one I have here, if we're following the whole beverage theming thing. Oh, and before I forget, Lume here is great. I mean, it is a Seiko, so it's got typical Seiko grade Lume. And in my longevity tests, I saw it to be on par with my Seiko Monster. Which leads us to the case and its rather larger footprint to talk about. The Sumo line is relatively new. It's not based on anything historic like, say, the Willards or the Turtles. However, it does have a really cool design, with its Omega-like twisted lugs, partially protected bezel, and curvy flowing sidewalls and chamfers similar to that of a Marine Master. It really is a great looking design. And just like the Marine Master, I think it strikes a good balance between tooly and something a little more elegant. I absolutely love my Marine Master Reduced, and I think this has a very similar feel to it. But it is a much larger case, with a width of 45mm and a 52mm lug-to-lug. Although, I think it is important to note that while most of us would consider this to be really large, but when it comes to Seiko, 45 isn't overly large. I mean, a turtle is sitting at 44, as is the Marine Master and the Samurais. So this is only a tad larger than those. And similar to those watches, for its size, the Sumo is surprisingly and remarkably comfortable. Keyword there is size, because it is still a 45 and there's no getting around that. And that is going to be an issue for many, including myself. Even though I thought it was pretty comfortable, on occasion I would feel that crown hitting the back of my wrist. Speaking of which, it is screwed down, but as typical of Seikos at this price range, it is unsigned, as well as I think a bit large in proportion, making it easy to get a hold of and use, but it looks a little bit off in my opinion. So great looking watch, and I think the case here works perfectly with the dial. And ideally, this is for someone with a larger wrist, or for those that really just appreciate larger designs. And if that's you, it's hard to go wrong with this one, with just how good it looks and how comfortable it is. And I think a lot of that comfort is really coming from the bracelet, which is another interesting aspect of this watch, and I think the Sumos in general. Now, for the most part, it is a standard Seiko bracelet. It's an oyster style with these fine polished sections on the middle links. It is solid end links, solid links, pin and collar system, all with a pressed clasp and that funky diver's extension thingamabobber. Like I said, typical Seiko bracelet. However, one thing that's not is the female end links, which helps reduce the effective lug-to-lug to something a tad more manageable. Plus, it's really interesting here that Seiko went with a 20mm bracelet on this one, which again, proportionally I think looks a little bit off, and especially when you swap it to a strap. But I think it makes it much more comfortable and manageable, at least on my 7¼ inch wrist, so I think the trade-off is a good one. As on the wrist, I thought it was well balanced, and one I could wear all day. So I think there's a lot to like here, but in the end I thought it was still one that was a little larger than I'd want. And one more thing before we start to wrap this whole thing up, if you haven't noticed, this watch is one with a typical Seiko quality control, as the second hand is close, but not quite lined up. And the same goes for the bezel. It's definitely not the worst I've ever seen, but it's also not the best. And I could go on and on complaining about it, but I've done that enough in other videos with much more expensive Seikos. So you've all heard it before, and let's just leave it at that. As for price and value, MSRP here is $775 US, but I have seen them recently in the low 500s on Joma Shop. Now 800 I think we could all agree is too much, but what about 5? Is it not? It's kind of hard to say as there really isn't anything else with this movement. But I think because of that price and because of its size and the quartz thing, I can't really see this one being a massive hit. And in a lot of ways, this is all sort of fitting for a Sumo, as they've always been sort of a quiet cult hit and kind of an in-betweener, at least compared to other Seiko divers, as they've always cost a little bit more than the entry-level divers, yet they've never really had the full specs of the more serious pro spec models. I mean, they are a great watch for someone that wants something larger, but it always felt like they were just suffering from an identity crisis in terms of who it was really for. And the Solar GMT version feels that way as well. Most collectors and enthusiasts would kill for a reasonably priced Seiko True GMT. Yet the fact that this is quartz is gonna give them pause. While regular folks who would love a good solar watch may not really understand what a GMT is or want to pay that much for it. It's also kind of late to the party, a victim of timing, so to speak. As a couple of years ago, I think this would have made a really interesting prospect for someone that wanted a GMT. As a couple of years ago, your options for a GMT in this price point were much more limited. And even those enthusiasts who prefer autos or may not want something this big would have been interested in it. But last year, Seiko themselves introduced the new affordable NH34 movement, which let them, as well as a ton of others, flood the market with good affordable collars GMTs, all for a bit less than a Solar Sumo. And then last year as well, Miyota introduced their new 9075 True GMT movement, which has allowed a number of brands to create good True GMTs for a little bit more than a Solar Sumo. Ones with sizes and styles that may be a bit more appealing for you. Which, once again, sort of leaves the Sumo as this odd duck just sitting on the sidelines. Bottom line, it's a good watch, maybe even a great watch. And other than the typical unpredictable Seiko QC shenanigans, there's nothing wrong with it, and a lot right with it. For some, it's a good or great fit. For those really wanting a good grab and go, if not larger quartz GMT. For someone that wants a good watch that they don't ever really need to worry about. Although for most people, I think there are just going to be some better options out there for both enthusiasts and the general public. But as usual, let me know what you think. Let me know your thoughts on the watch, the size, the movement, as well as the design. And let me know if there's another watch that you think does it better. And as always, you guys know what to do down below. Like, comment, subscribe, share the video. Helps the channel out. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and I'll see you next time.